Hi, I'm Brad Power, and this is the Cancer Patient Lab. This is our weekly webinar series, and today we're working on an exciting topic, which we've been doing at the Cancer Patient Lab, which is helping people use general purpose AI tools to guide their care. Um, what used to be Dr. Google has become Dr. ChatGPT. Increasingly, people are using AI to help them get information, to help them diagnose their situations, figure out medical terms, prepare for appointments, interpret their situation, interpret scans, reports they get, etc. There's a lot of potential uses, and people are increasingly using AI. But at the same time, there are concerns. It's a new technology. People aren't sure what it can do, what it might do, how the information is being used. And whenever there's new territory, there are concerns about what might be going on. And so we need to protect ourselves and be aware of what the safety and privacy concerns might be and could be. Today's session is largely going to be, hopefully, the group assembled here will share some of their concerns, some of their issues, either experienced or things they've heard about, or concerns they might have that they just, feel. And to help us in that conversation, we have Dina Blikshteyn of Haynes Boone, which is the law firm of Roger Royce, who's also on the session. And she's an expert in AI. She serves on their AI committee. And so she's going to be available to have comments or maybe to have a few things to say. Um, Ari Akerstein is also a resource here. Ari is developing, he's a software developer from Silicon Valley originally. He really understands what's happening with AI. He's building with AI, and so he understands the work involved and the capabilities of these new tools. And in particular, he worked at Meta, which if there's ever any precedent for the concerns of the unintended consequences of a new technology like social media was and like AI is, it has to do with unintended consequences. There are a lot of wonderful potentials. There are a lot of things that are incredibly valuable, but there's also some unintended negative consequences. We need to understand what those are and mitigate those, as we've learned, over time with social media and wanting to be similarly armed and ready when we deal with AI. Um, again, I want to open it up for general discussion, but I want to give Dina and Ari a chance to just say a few words on any kinds of points of view, thoughts, kind of structuring the conversation today before we get started. Dina, do you have anything that you just sort of like want to set the stage here a little bit?
Sure, Brad. I'd be happy to. And I'll just give the lay of the land of what's going on with AI in the legal context right now. So with the new administration taking hold last year, we had Trump's executive order in January, which translated into an AI action plan in July of this year. Right. So what's happening here is there's a lot of deregulation on the federal level, and essentially, this administration's position is to have AI advance as much as possible, essentially at the cost of everything else, right? So the Biden's executive order was an opposite of that. It was more regulation, more DEI, more guardrails around bias, right? With this administration on a federal level, it's make AI development as fast as possible, almost at expense of everything else. All right, so as a result of that, we may be seeing more legislation at a state level. So for example, New York came out with legislations directed to it where AI is being used as a companion. Right, so and that came out of November last month, where if AI starts to perceive that the person may have suicidal thoughts, AI needs to recommend a human doctor for that person to talk to. Right, so we're starting to see the sprinkling of state regulation in response to Trump's executive order. And I think this may only be the beginning. So last legislation slash regulation at the federal level and more at the state level. So that's what I think will be happening in the next 3 years.
Is it fair to characterize the environment as full speed ahead? We'll try to clean up the mess afterwards. We ask for forgiveness, not permission.
I think that's correct, Brad. And I think if you want the technology to develop any technology, not just AI, that may be the right approach to take. Sort of see how far we can get, see where the holes and the issues are, and then you start with regulation or legislation.
And so we as consumers or patients or caregivers, I guess the rule would be caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. In other words, the responsibility is on us because the government's not going to be doing much to protect us.
That's correct. So with that caveat, right, there are non-AI legislation and laws that are in place, right? There are privacy laws that are in place on the state level, right? Some states have more AI specific laws than others, right? There's consumer protections that are in place, but those are not necessarily AI specific, right? So there is a framework that can be used generally. I think the question becomes whether AI can fit into the current laws or whether additional laws will be necessary.
And the flip side of that is presumably you have large corporate clients that you're advising on this. So if you are advising the cancer patient lab or the startup that Arya and I are working on about you're going in this territory of AI, how can you protect yourselves or yes, I guess protect yourselves from the potential hallucinations or mistakes that the AI tools that people may be using may make?
Right. So, I mean, hallucination comes really, and I think Ari can probably speak to this better than I can, either from incomplete training data sets, right, or from the lack of guardrails. Because all these models are trained to answer questions. And if they don't know an answer to the question, they will just make it up, right? And that's to make AI more user-friendly. Because if the AI starts to say, I don't know, people will not be as apt to use it as if AI could come up with an answer every single time.
Thank you. There's a quick question in the chat before I turn it over to Ari from Richard Anders. What about Trump's order to preempt state regulations?
So Trump tried, right? So when the big beautiful bill was being discussed, what Trump wanted a 10-year moratorium on state regulation. So that did not pass through. What Trump did do, though, is using the funding to the states almost as a caveat to start to regulate state legislation of AI. But at the same time, that's only applicable to the systems that the federal government will be buying, right? So
Okay,
there is some leeway in regulation. It's not a complete moratorium.
thank you. Okay, Ari, do you want to set the stage, give us a few points of view on this topic?
Sure. That was a awesome overview, Dina, actually. I think the point of view that I'll take, number one, the fact that, so I come from sort of background, a lot of my career has been spent in consumer tech, and really, if you want to think about ambiguous and sort of intractable problems, go work in privacy at Meta. It's an unwinnable landscape, and I naively, thought that, that something could change. It's a machine, it marches on, and one of the observations that I had is that on the one hand, this is a very stark reality, and maybe many of you can relate to this. I have a few slides that I can flash up as well. I'll sort of maybe not, if the opportunity presents, I'll flash them up. But I think there's an inevitability to the adoption of these tools, and so we probably could do a quick show of hands here. How many folks have actually used AI for medical questions or care? I think the reality right now is that despite the ambiguity of what these laws are, and is it going to be a kind of patchwork of, state regulations? Is it going to be a federal thing? Whatever. The reality is that ChatGPT and these AIs are one of the fastest adopted technologies of all time, which is really incredible. Um, I was going to flash up a slide that I saw this morning, which showed a sort of doubling of doctor wait times, just to underscore sort of the motivations from a patient perspective, despite the hallucinations, lack of guardrails, lack of privacy protections, and all these things, essentially showing a doubling from '09 to no, from 2010 to 2025 in wait times just to go see a doctor. So on the one hand, you have fast, cheap, and easy, accessible 24/7. And on the other hand, you have, I'm going to wait for a doctor with, unevenness on that side in terms of, the quality and those things. And I think what we see is just an inevitable drive toward adoption from a patient perspective toward these tools. And so, like, that's not going to change. We're not going to pump the brakes on that. But I do think there's a lot of interesting maybe questions that I'm thinking about, which might be things like, let me actually flash up a slide just to illustrate the point. Brad, you said I have
You should have.
access. Let me just do something here real quick. Um, okay. Can you see
Working.
the slide here?
Yep.
Okay. And so there's a bit of a disconnect that I've seen, and I'll use sort of, general consumer privacy as a good model, just because we don't necessarily have a better one in the AI world just yet. Where on the one hand, if you do a focus group and you ask people, they'll say, I'm concerned about X, Y, and Z, everything, in terms of privacy and harms. And the next slide, I'll show some of the harms that I think might help frame the conversation. On the other hand, you see adoption and some of the forces of adoption. And so social media is a great example where, people are adopting it. And we all thought maybe 15 years ago that globalization was an obvious good for everybody. And, like there's unintended consequences, as you mentioned, Brad. And so I think at least one frame, and I'd be curious what people think, but when it comes to adoption, I thought that maybe there's a clear way to frame this, which is, it is uploading my medical records, and let's use that as an example. Will it help me now? Do I have a pressing, urgent need to actually like get an answer? I don't have any other place to go, and it's really easy and accessible. So will it help me now? Okay, yes. Will it harm me later? And that's, I think, in at least from what I've seen, it's a bit of an ambiguous territory, and we'll dig into that maybe in the next slide. And then there's sort of a reversibility question or a persistence of the data. Where does it live? Is this here forever? Can I delete? And those are, I think, real questions. But I just thought the chart on the right is really a nice illustrator of, look, if it's going to take me 30 days on average in any metro city to go see a doctor, I mean, it's obvious where I'm going to go. Um, what I thought, and this is a work in progress. I literally put this together right before the this meeting, so I would love Dina, poke holes if anything doesn't seem right or anybody else. But I thought at least to get the conversation started, we could kind of think about what are the actual harms that people are thinking about, and maybe these are right and maybe they're incomplete. I'm not sure. I'd be curious what people think. But at least in my mind, maybe we could break it down into what are the types of harms on kind of one axis, and maybe on the other we could think about something like ChatGPT and the consumer AI or naked LLM. Like if I go and upload my records to Claude or OpenAI or whatever model Perplexity are using. We could also think about HIPAA, and that often comes up in conversation. Sometimes the definitions themselves are a bit ambiguous. People say, HIPAA, like it's a gold standard. I think it's more kind of a floor than a ceiling on protections, but we could maybe get into that if it's useful. And then maybe kind of a theoretical aspiration. Well, what would the best in class actually look like, where everybody would feel good and confident about asking AIs about their care. So anyway, I kind of put this up, not necessarily to go through in detail, but maybe just to frame the conversation and just spark some thoughts from the group, but really here to learn and kind of hear where people's heads are at, and like, does this seem generally right, or are people thinking about it in a totally different way? So I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing, but I thought maybe that could just be a useful frame to think about, well, what are the harms specifically we're talking about? What are the protections specifically we're talking about? And and where are they specifically impacting behavior and action? And not, I will never upload my records to ChatGPT because XYZ. Would love to understand what are those things. So I'll kind of stop there and hand it back to you, Brad.
Thank you. I want to ask Dina to comment on what you just commented on, but before I do, all right, one of the unique things that you can bring to this conversation is observed behavior versus expressed behavior, expressed feelings. And
Yeah,
so there's a lot of people that are concerned, for example, about security, and therefore the HIPAA laws are have been created to protect people's privacy and security. Yet we as patients care more about surviving than we do about our privacy. And so there's kind of like benefit cost trade-offs. And what you, I think, observed when you were at Facebook Meta is that people would say things, but then their behavior might be something different. Can you speak to that a little bit?
sure. Yeah, we did a lot of usability, and I mean, a third of humans use, whether it's so I was working, Instagram, Facebook, Oculus, like they call it the family of apps. Many people don't even know that they're all, under the same umbrella, which is sort of astonishing. But taken together, you do have a good chunk of humanity using every month these various tools. And what you see is a absolutely, to me, I was just like always amazed at the disconnect between when you'll do these, they call it UXR, user experience research studies, and you're doing qualitative and ethnographic kind of follow-alongs, and getting like um, a deep dive on how people think about it, and it's always negative. And you could look at brand sentiment, which I always found fascinating. And one of the least trusted companies, like maybe that you could ever find, is Meta, it seems, or at least Facebook. But they love Instagram, even though the protections are very similar, which tells you the importance of branding and awareness on this. But the disconnect was just fascinating because on the one hand, you would think that as brand sentiment goes down, usage, activity, and other things would follow and be correlated. But actually, you see that the usage action is somewhat anti-correlated with that sentiment, which is to say that people will tell you all kinds of things about how much privacy matters to them, how creepy it is that ads are, following them around the internet. Thank you, Facebook Pixel. And all these things. On the other hand, it doesn't hurt usage at all. And so just get on any earnings call, up and to the right, absolutely astonishing. And so there's a disconnect there. And so I think what I was trying to get to in the earlier commentary is that there's probably a very elegant chart that one could draw that says, when the harm, the impact of the harm, or the immediateness and specificity of the harm is strong enough, then people will actually change behavior. But until that point, it's probably words. And so I do think it's important to tease those two things apart, particularly with something like AI that's, it's gaining steam like no other consumer product ever.
One more question with you with your insider view. Uh, we have an interaction with an AI. We upload our medical records and we ask a question. We upload a test result, whatever it may be. And the concern may be that's my personal data. That's very private data. What happens with it? And
Yeah.
yet, what you've seen on the inside of Facebook is the graph, I guess it's called, the graph, meaning the profile that they have of every individual, you, me, and everybody else, and the extent of that and the accuracy of that. Can you speak to what's already the cat's, the cow's already out of the barn? Like what is already available to Google and Meta and Amazon and these large organizations that have scraped a lot of data about any one of us?
Well, there's maybe like two levels at least to talk about. One is behaviors on the internet, right? Like what website did you go to? what did you buy? What's your email? And there's all kinds of crazy activities out there that aren't worth getting into. But there's a lot of activity in splicing together various emails and signups with other activity. But let's call that the activity layer of just stuff you did. I think what we're talking about with the medical stuff, my records, is a fundamental kind of identity question, almost like email, but it's a biometric. Yeah, I mean, my genome is my genome, right? Like theoretically, one could walk it back and figure out, what is the connection between these things. Um, but I think it's somewhat, they're a little bit orthogonal to one another in my mind, where like, you can upload your medical data or what's called your PHI, your personal health information, which would be things that can be tied back to you as an individual. And I think these are like more fundamental kinds of identifiers, pointers that ultimately could persist. You can change your email, I suppose, at some point. Are you going to change your genome? These become very interesting questions, but ultimately, I think it's going to still come back to, I think, and I haven't thought it through deep enough, maybe Dina or other people have, um, but it's a little bit of a difference here when we're talking about our medical data and just what am I going to do and how am I going to safeguard that information versus other things that I might do on the internet. Um, are they different? Are they not different? Is that fundamental calculus of the immediacy, the specificity of the harm, is it sufficient to overcome the immediate obvious benefit? And again, with all the caveats of hallucinations and guardrails, and is it wrong? And is it, just tell me what I want to hear and all these things. Um, I don't know. I suspect it's probably a very similar human dynamic of decision making in the end that undergirds it, and it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about something as fundamental as your genome or, like just my web behavior. But those are like two levels that seem to me maybe a little bit distinct. I'd be curious what Dina thinks actually, if that resonates or if she has like a different way of constructing the universe here.
So the way I think of it is this. Right now, for public models like ChatGPT or similar, anything personal that you put in those will be gathered and used at some point, right? So
Totally agree with that, by the way.
right. So what I advise at least our clients, if you're going to use public models, do not put any personal information in there, right? At the same time, you can anonymize the information, right? So if I'm saying, well, here's my medical data, but I'm removing Brad Power and any other identifying characteristics, some people may be more comfortable with that, right? Something else to think about. So ChatGPT, and again, Ari can correct me on this, it's not retrained in real time, right? It may be retrained every few months or every few years. So whatever you're putting in there will not be traced back to you in real time as well. So that's almost like another layer of comfort. Now that's not true for all the models, but at least the publicly available one that seems to be correct.
Can I add just one point on that, which I agree with all of that. The one thing that is probably obvious to everybody, it becomes more obvious the closer you get to it on a day to day, is that this world is changing very, very quickly. And, we're a little bit pretending that we know where it's going to be in 5 years. None of us know. The thing I'll say is that whatever is true today may not be true tomorrow. And this is a very, very fast evolving landscape. And it's somewhat breathtaking and astonishing as somebody who's spent, my whole career in technology and been close to it and seen mobile and how crazy that was. This is just, I mean, several orders of magnitude different. So while it may be true that they're not trained in real time, I mean, who knows in a year from now? The models are moving so quickly. Um, so yeah, it just as backdrop to all of this.
Yeah, that's correct. The other thing I wanted to address is also when HIPAA applies, because I think that's going to resonate with a lot of folks on this call. Right. So HIPAA
Mm.
does not apply to everything. So for example, to ChatGPT or similar, HIPAA will not apply. Because HIPAA applies in certain instances, and you have to meet three elements for those, right? It has to be a covered entity or a vendor working with a covered entity. Now, the covered entity is a hospital, healthcare plan, healthcare providers, and similar, right? Then it has to be PHI, right? Protected health information. And third, it has to be used for covered function, right? Again, legalese, but it's a treatment, healthcare payments, and healthcare operations, right? So HIPAA would apply in those instances. And again, all three of those conditions must be met. If you're talking about um, like AI chatbots for everyone, right? Sort of like ChatGPT for healthcare, HIPAA does not apply to those, right? So there is a gap, right? We know at least at this point, the federal government won't do much about it. So we're relying on different states, right? And that's going back to the AI companion legislation that was just passed in New York. That was an attempt by New York to fill the gap of putting some regulation about companion chatbots where HIPAA will not necessarily apply.
Yeah. Can I ask Dina a question, just more kind of on the legal side? But when you think about, and I know before I kind of got deeper into this a bunch of years ago, I thought like HIPAA was some kind of gold standard. It's the first thing, like everybody knows that it rolls off the tongue. Everyone says, "Ah, what about HIPAA?" In your experience at least one way that I think about it that I was getting at with that matrix was kind of general consumer, like what ChatGPT has to do just to pick on them, versus Epic or MyChart or any covered entity with respect to HIPAA. Do you think of HIPAA as some kind of gold standard? Do you think of like how do you, from a legal perspective, think about that? Um, yeah, I'd just be curious your point of view because
Well,
in my mind there's a continuum on the consumer side, whereas HIPAA is more of just a covered, it's for providers, it's for legal, it's for billing and RCM and stuff. But does that align with how you think about it, or do you have a different way?
so the way I look at HIPAA is HIPAA is meant to protect hospital and healthcare providers, right? I look at it more from that perspective than HIPAA is trying to protect consumers,
I
right?
see.
So it's giving you a minimal baseline of how to protect PHI, but it by no means is it a gold standard. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna caveat this that this is my opinion. This is not legal advice.
But by the way, can I interject on that? None of this is legal advice. This is all just general information for the record.
We
Yeah.
know they're competent lawyers now, so we should listen to them. Um, the because I think it's an important point that a lot of people, at least anecdotally that I talk to, don't really tend to grasp is that it's like HIPAA is around this more like legal protections for covered entities, but it's not patient facing. It's not, like data ownership or agency or anything along those lines. So yeah.
Okay, let me try to open up the conversation to the audience more generally. Now, you can either ask questions of Dina or Ari if they've triggered something you want to ask, but I also wanted to hear any stories people have. And Ari touched on harms, and he even gave a sort of categorization scheme for different kinds of harms. Um, I'm curious about hearing stories here. What are actual mistakes, errors, harms that you've seen yourself or seen others? And then also concerns, speculative is concerns you have, the things that might be a concern, something that might happen. And then also categorizing those as either transitory or permanent. Because one of the things that's important, I think Ari touched on it, is these tools are getting better and better every day. And you come out with a new version of Gemini, a new version of ChatGPT, a new version of Claude, et cetera. Every time these come out, they're that much better. And so the hallucinations go down, the mistakes go down. And so you can predict that while I experienced, like, I mean, some of the first ones, weren't they recommending pizzas with rocks in them or something? There were a lot of silly examples early on, but those get fixed once they occur. And so it's going to be going up and approaching 99% um, uh, reliable over time. And so we want to be concerned about issues that are going to persist and are permanent. The sycophantic behavior, for example, is something that they may not be able to uh, uh, code out of the AI has to have a personality, and that personality could be sycophantic. That could be forever. So so maybe we can have distinctions between things that may go away and things that are going to persist just because of the nature of the business model. One of the things that Ari and I chat a lot about is the ChatGPT is grounded in very conservative medicine in the guidelines. And so it won't let you go outside of that unless you're kind of clever to go outside of that to say, well, what was recently published in the literature about the same subject? It only will reflect and give you very solid conservative evidence. So that's another thing that might persist into the future, but your interest may be different than that. So opening it up, use the raise hand feature or put things in the chat if you want to ask a question either or share a story. Be very interested to hear from the audience.
Can,
Ari.
can I just, sorry, just one more point that I think connects with what you just said. There is a a sort of transparency opacity question inside of here, and not to get a little too technical, but how repeatable are the results? And I think that's an interesting question to ask, which comes down to transparency. And so, about this hallucination that we talk about and, sycophantic behavior, there's something around, uh, let's call it how deterministic, how repeatable are going to be. Like if I ask the same question 100 times of ChatGPT, will I get 100 of the same answers, or is there a spread on that? And then can you trace that back to the source? At least from what I've seen, and it seems to be getting better. The source material, I mean, I get a lot of 404 pages if you actually follow the links. I don't know if you all do that, but it's like, what is this? This URL doesn't even exist that you just cited. And so there's something somewhat concerning in that. But when we think about the shift from search, which, there's web pages and you can go find them and you can click on them, which is the Google model, that's somewhat deterministic. But on the chat thing, it's so generative, it's so fast, and there's a lot of spread in the answers, and you don't necessarily know that they're repeatable. So I do think that that's an interesting aspect to just think about with respect to, can I trace back like to truth, to some kind of ground truth, whatever the heck this thing just said, that sounds great, but is totally wrong. So that feels like just an important dimension to bear in mind here when we think about the improvement of these models over time and maybe what a more robust system might look like that is more transparent and repeatable and deterministic, let's just say.
There's a comment in the chat here from Alan Morris. I joined late. Is sycophantic behavior synonymous with confirmation bias? And the answer is yes, that basically the personality of these AIs, giving them what they call anthropomorphism, you're giving them human personality tendencies, is to give people what they want and to make them happy. And that will then steer the AI to sycophant, meaning give people obsequiously what they want. So yes, that's what that meant. So again, I'd like to open it up now. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share? Experiences, concerns, issues?
Yeah, perhaps in regards to sycophantic behavior, I think that was obvious in the very beginning. You can now with ChatGPT 5 actually adjust the personality, whether it should be more amiable or whether it should actually be more factual. So that can be now adjusted. And then there are also the guardrails. So for example, when I'm asking ChatGPT in regards to certain therapeutic options for a specific medical case, what is very clear is that it basically reverts very quickly to, let's say, if I'm asking a medical question on physiology and let's say, what's the best diagnostic and which has the best sensitivity and specificity, it gives you the accurate answer. And then if you then ask, okay, I have a patient with XYZ who would like to have the most accurate test, which one should be applied, it will automatically revert to the guidelines. So ChatGPT seems to have very strong guardrails that are consistent with NCCN guidelines or other rules and regulation and what the insurance covers, and basically then ignores the previous information on what's the most accurate diagnostic. It's actually an interesting observation. Yes, it's sycophantic, but when it comes to medical questions, it is very conformist in a way to what is considered established medical care and guidelines and care.
Okay, there's a question in the chat from Alexander Lalov. Ari, have you found what are the differences between ChatGPT and Gemini in regards to the results?
Hmm. Man, that's a hard one. The Gemini 3 that just came out seems to be really good. I haven't dug in too much in detail on, was it about Gemini versus,
Yeah,
sorry,
he
what,
chose Gemini and ChatGPT, but I'm sure
uh,
he's,
I've
could be
seen,
any.
I, I, I've shown some of you this. Not so much on Gemini because it's still really new, or the new Gemini is really new. The ones that I've seen really big differences in are um, okay, let me put it, I'm gonna put in like two dimensions here. Bear with me. One is LLMs versus other LLMs, and we're talking about just kind of these frontier models that we've all heard about, Claude, version something, or OpenAI version something, ChatGPT version something. And so one cut would be comparing those different models, one against the other. Um, I think one of the best ones that I've seen is actually Anthropic, um, which is Claude. They use them synonymously. The Opus 4.5, I think it is. And I'm looking at like cancer specific things. And that one tends to do a really good job across the board. Another thing that at least I started looking at, back to this deterministic question earlier, is uh, when you think about an LLM, you can ask your question to any of these models and you can get an answer. You can also think about building a corpus of actual training data or kind of, cancer specific content, let's just call it. And you can train the model in different interesting ways to use that first. And then you just use the AI to help summarize and kind of put that in a bundle and deliver it to as a response. And the thing that I've noticed, and in talking with other engineering friends of mine, that we've noticed is that the better your training data and the less reliant you are on the like the LLM for the full response, you can do a few interesting things. You can make the responses faster, just for technical reasons. The second one is you can make it more repeatable. And then the third thing is you can make it more transparent because you know what that training data actually is. So you can point preferentially to what you think are the right sources rather than relying on whatever the frontier models themselves are relying on, which you don't really control that much. And so the biggest distinction that I've seen is on the training data, owning that training or like training the models on the training data and the responses that come back, which are composed of multiple steps, and using the material that you have preferentially, and then just use the LLMs as kind of a wrapper. And if you do that, then the LLMs become less important, and the differences between them, and you can score them, and this can get a little bit technical and beyond what we're talking about here. But the point is you can control more of what that output is in the direction that you think is accurate, repeatable, measurable, scoreable, all that, and make sure that you feel good about what you're actually returning. I'm not sure if that exactly addressed the question, so happy to like take that in a different direction if that didn't get at it.
Um, Okay, I'm going to go to the next question in the chat from Russ. Is having an opinion actionable, and should we attempt to remove opinions?
Man, that's a philosophical question.
Can I break it? That was in response to Alan saying that we have lots of opinions by citizen scientists. So I was wondering, well, really, is that a comment or is that an actionable concern? And what should we do if we want to do anything about it? Kind of, yeah, you
Can
get
I
where I'm
can I can
right
I can I just insert something on that, Russ? Which is
there.
that look, the way these things are going to get built, just because the way you're building out these guys are in this arms race, as I think Dina mentioned at the very like outset. This is a fast moving technology. A lot of the administration is constructing this as sort of an arms race with other with China and closed models and open and all this stuff. And so there's a lot of drivers here, but ultimately there's an interesting question embedded in what you said, Russ, which is, opinions, there could be the right way and the wrong way, and maybe we have the right, like what's actually the right answer here. The other way is just what ends up working and driving engagement with people. And I think the reality of human behavior is the more sycophantic and opinion based, like people will use it more and they'll like it more. And so they'll do it more. And, that's going to be the thing that wins in the end, independent of whether it's right or we like it.
Yes, exactly. Independent of whether it's right or wrong. If
Yeah.
you like the answer, yeah.
What I hear in this question, there were a couple of others as well. David said, another common human trait is to keep asking the same question or of different sources until they get the answer they want. I would like to ask Dina and Ari both to speak to the human information interface. So, one of the things is having a healthy skepticism, for example, knowing that it's not always perfect. How trustworthy is it? Can you just sort of speak to the, as speaking to us as consumers or users of this information, how should we be relating to the information that we're getting on a spectrum again of trusting, just naturally trusting it comes, it looks, sounds reasonable versus having a skepticism and we've developed principles that says you should cross-check this stuff. You should be skeptical and thinking about that, how we use it, how we relate to the information that's being presented and the answers to the questions. Dina, do you have any thoughts on that?
So anything that comes out of a AI model should be treated with a grain of salt. I mean, they're right most of the time, but they do hallucinate, and you don't want to take a hallucination as a ground truth. Right. So when I use the models, either the public ones or the legal models that are more of a private nature, I always double check and cross check the answer that they give us. Because as many guardrails as you may have, like nothing is going to be perfect. And this is a very fast and evolving technology. So at least until it develops or slows down, I would always check and verify.
And how different would that be from if you were dealing with a human? I find it interesting because, we have our relationships with our doctors who we typically trust and assume that they're all wise. Like Russ raised this once we were saying, or no, it was Bill Passman in a previous session we had, which was you're expecting your interaction with the AI to be like what you would be having with a doctor, but it's not. And I think, the kind of skepticism you're talking about of the cross-checking is not typical in relationships we have with humans.
I mean, I think it's typical. So, and I'll talk to it from a legal perspective, right? If I'm having a work product, whether it's delivered by an associate or by AI, right? It's my job to make sure that the work product is correct, right? Because if something goes wrong, the attorney will always be blamed, right? And it doesn't matter who put it out. And we see it with fake case citations in front of courts and fake case law, right? So it's up to the end user to really verify the output, right? And especially with AI, when at this point we know that this thing hallucinates and that it does produce incorrect results. right? On the other hand, using these AI models is the same thing as using Google, right? Or Bing, right? The information is on the web. You can get the information. Do you really know it's correct?
Yeah.
Right. You can look at multiple sources and then you verify.
I was gonna just build on that, which is I have this riff that, we talk about the AIs, they hallucinate. Doctors hallucinate too. Probably many of us know this, sadly. Uh, and one has a self-correcting, the optimistic version is that the AIs at least have some self-correcting loop. And so it would be really interesting to look at the error rates between humans and AIs over time. Like, I'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. The plane of this conversation, however, is probably 2 or 3 levels higher than AI, however, Brad, which is, how do you trust any information? One could argue even that the state of our society today is one that you don't actually know who to trust anymore. And it's a crisis right now. Do you trust the mainstream media? Do you trust this? Do you trust that? Do you trust your doctor? It's a gigantic problem. AI is just, inserting another very important voice into the conversation. But I think this is a big problem that we have as a society, and I don't think it starts and ends with AI. It transcends AI. It transcends, it's which machine, which human, is that image real? This is one of the big problems of our time. So it's well beyond the AI question. AI just makes it all crazier.
It's not a new
Chris,
issue at all. I'm reminded of a story about President Harry Truman, who was getting advice from his economic advisors, and they would say, well, on the one hand, if you do this, it'll have such and such a result. And on the other hand, if you do this, it'll have such and such a result. And finally, in frustration, Harry Truman said, I need to find an economist with only one hand.
I was wondering, Chris, since you're very good on statistics, are there any statistics on error rates? I always am reminded that autonomous driven cars don't have to be perfect. They just, and we, every time there's an accident, it gets all publicity. But humans kill people in auto accidents in the US, like in hundreds of thousands a year. And so the comparison of the autonomous driving should not be to perfection, but rather to humans. And so having statistics on what humans do would be an important comparison. Chris, do you know of any statistics on error rates of doctors?
Um, there are error rates on physicians, but you can also look at the USMLEs, right? The United States Medical License Exams that every medical student has to take in order to get a license and enter residency. And there is of course, there is a normal distribution, and the ChatGPT 4 was clearly outperforming the average. I think it was somewhere on the 80s or 90s percentile. So there is an error rate also for ChatGPT, but it's actually pretty good if you compare it to the medical student knowledge. ChatGPT, one needs to see it as a language model. What I sometimes noticed is even if I give a scientific publication and there is some logical inconsistency, it can't see the images unless you ask it to do. It actually just reads the text and regurgitates what's written in that document, and makes it argument. It actually is not. It has its limitations on critically reflecting on a scientific paper, interestingly.
Okay.
There is another question I had in terms of privacy and HIPAA. So SageMatic is a CLIA certified California registered lab. So, and we are doing, we have a functional precision oncology platform, the Sage Oncotest, which is so wonderful. And so therefore, I think we are a covered entity. And so when I am using, I have what's this called, an account that's called a corporate account, enterprise account. And so with the enterprise account, I get the confirmation that the information will not be used for training purposes. What I have not been able to get is that it is actually also HIPAA compliant, but actually ChatGPT doesn't care about it. The what I do also have is now I have a Google Workspace account, and with the Google Workspace account I have a BAA, a Business Associate Agreement, and it explicitly says that the data that I have there, that I'm using there also with Gemini 3, is HIPAA compliant. So do you think that there is any level of difference in terms of privacy and HIPAA protection if I were using Gemini 3 versus the ChatGPT 5, let's say 5.2, which is now the latest version?
Now, again, not giving legal advice, but I'm thinking if there's a difference in terminology, there is something with compliance. But to give a more exact answer, you probably need to read the contracts and the legal obligations about what's going on with that data. Because it could be something where the data is not being used for training, but it may be used for something else. So unless it says it's HIPAA compliant, I would not assume that
Right.
it is.
But it's hard for me to imagine that ChatGPT, if you have an enterprise version and you're a company, that ChatGPT would use those data if you, let's say, give it access to your file server or your file system, that it would use this data as, let's say, competitive intelligence spy work from China. Right? I mean, it's
You find it hard to believe that they would?
yes. I mean, ChatGPT does not necessarily would like to disclose the information it gets from it uses, or when you're using it, and it wouldn't hand it over to China. I think
Oh,
this would be.
to China. Maybe there's two things. One is, yeah, probably not. The second thing is, but would they use it to train their models, potentially? I'm thinking about Amazon, right? Which famously, actually, many years ago, I was in a lawsuit with them or against them, where they ripped off some of their best-selling products on Amazon. So they're a marketplace, and like, oh, well, we wouldn't knock off the best-selling products, would we? Because we have access to all the sales data and like that. Well, they built out their Amazon Basics very famously. This was a big lawsuit where they knocked off the biggest certain vertical products, and this was a giant lawsuit because they basically took that data and used it for their own benefit and hurt the users of their platform. I don't find it too hard to believe that ChatGPT would do that. Again, using kind of the enterprise, like, hey, you're giving us some data about your day-to-day workings in your very successful company. Would we take that and maybe build a product out of that? I find that not very hard to believe that they would do that to gain an
Yeah,
edge.
and it's very interesting because I actually, it's because of the hallucination stuff. I actually have also used other AI platforms, such as there's one that is actually always looking at references, which I'm now blanking on the name. Russ, you like that platform? Can you remind me of what it is? And then when I was asking,
You're
I'm sorry?
probably thinking, are you thinking of Perplexity?
Yes. So I used Perplexity because it was actually giving me the references. Now, when I use ChatGPT 5, that issue is no longer an issue because if I ask for the references, it actually can look it up and it gives me the accurate references and reflects on it well. So I'm not using Perplexity anymore. But what I was surprised is when I was looking at the comparison of privacy on different AI platforms. So there seem to be two things. One, it's a question of whether you are using the user level or the enterprise level. And with the enterprise level, almost all platforms give you the reassurance that they will not use it for training purposes of their models, number one. And in the private, you can often switch it off. But what I was really surprised that both in the private and in the enterprise version, Perplexity is actually using that information also for personal profiling and targeting. And they have actually in their agreement, explicitly in there, that they can sell your information to third parties. And especially for Perplexity, because it was actually providing accurate scientific information, I was basically, I was, that is the opposite what I would have expected.
Hmm.
Okay, in the
Totally.
interest of time, I want to let Rick Davis ask his question. Dina, do you have a hard stop at the hour? Okay,
No,
great.
I'm good.
So go ahead, Rick. You're on mute.
Ask it for me. I've been trying to get it answered since the beginning. As you can hear, I'm not well. But there's a big elephant in the room and we're not addressing it. I don't understand why.
Oh, his question in the chat, Dina, is there are legal consequences if licensed professionals give bad advice. What are the consequences for AI?
Okay, so I will give you a typical legal answer that it depends. And it depends on the state legislation in which AI legislation applies. All right. So I looked into this last year, and there was almost more than 400 different AI related bills that were pending across the United States. And generally, you can break them down into two things. There is a private right of action, and then there is no private right of action, which means everything goes to the Attorney General. And then the Attorney General may sue the company on behalf of the state. Right. So if there's a private right of action, then an individual can sue the company if AI misrepresents something. For generative AI type bots, right, it's usually all they need to do is have a disclaimer that you're talking to AI and not the real person, and that the information may be inaccurate for them to overcome that bar. In terms, again, it can be, I guess the legal ramifications can be on per use basis, right? So if you can use it, if you continue using AI and it's wrong, they'll be penalizing you per use. Some of them will penalize you per day, but the general trend is most of this legislation. It gives the power to the Attorney General and not to the end consumer.
So has is there any case law? Has it been tested? Has anybody acted on AI advice with adverse consequences and gone after the AI company?
So I am not aware of anything in the healthcare space, right? There's a lot of lawsuits going on in the copyright space right now with training data. But in terms of generative AI and AGs, I'm not aware of anything. Like if you almost want like a framework for it, I would look at the AI Colorado Act, where it's directed to high-risk systems, and it gives obligations to both developers and deployers, and the risk management frameworks, and sort of what happens when things go wrong. So I would look at that act in particular if you're looking for something more of a framework approach.
Okay.
Can I ask a question to Dina just based on that, which I think is really interesting? Oftentimes, when it comes to the medical, call it medical advice or whatever, one can put disclaimers in front and and the legal guardrails, let's just say. Often, not always, there's a doctor in between, the whatever the advice is and the care itself. Not always, for sure. But I also wonder whether some of the more immediate harms, like, there's been pretty interesting, I think, mental health and even suicidal kinds of things emerging from conversations with AI, hallucinatory or not. And there you don't really have a human, in between necessarily that thing. And so I wonder just from litigation perspective, whether there's a more direct line in going after that kind of thing versus, I don't know, oh, I want to know about ivermectin, and then I go ask my doctor, and then I go get it, or I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if there's a clean way to think about that,
So
but
there is a way to think about it if it's regulated by HIPAA, right? Which means it's a bot produced by the hospitals or vendors or similar, or if it's just bots that directed at consumers. So if it's directed at consumers, HIPAA does not apply.
yeah, that's right.
Which is part of it, which is why New York came up with this legislation for AI companions, and if there are suicidal thoughts, then you have to involve a doctor.
Yeah,
Right. But
yeah,
I looked at that legislation earlier this week, and the penalty I think is $15,000 per instance. And it's also there's no private right of action. It's up to the state attorney general. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think like if you look at it on a very broad scale, right, they don't want to, even the states don't want to stifle AI technology too much right now. They want to let it develop, right?
yeah,
And in
that's
that
right.
way, they're putting more risks on consumers rather than the developers and deployers, just so the technology can develop, you can see what else it can come up with.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
if you're looking at the opposite perspective, look at the EU AI Act, right? Not a lot of places want to innovate in Europe right now just because EU AI Act makes it so difficult,
yeah.
right? So the AI development in Europe right now is way behind what's going on in
Yeah,
the US.
the interesting knock-on effect it seems is you over-regulate and then they'll be irrelevant essentially, so they won't even be in the conversation most likely, and then
Right.
it'll be, do they go to China or the US for their models or something else? So
I know. I
yeah,
think Jeff Dwyer's been trying to get a question in. Is
Well, it's not so much a question as just an observation. Um, I got notified by, um, I think it's the state of New York, that Anthropic had agreed to a settlement of $1.5 billion on behalf of our clients, meaning anybody that's a literary agent or the actual client can download the data that Anthropic used to build their large language model, take our client's name and then the
mm,
titles of the books that were we've seen this in the publishing world coming from when Google started scanning the books, and they said they'd only scan the out of print. And I said, well, that's bullshit. Eventually, they scanned everything that they could lay their hands on.
yeah,
And so you knew that it was coming, and that was coming 20 years ago. So when the large language models took it, they did it through a class action suit. So that's working its way through now. And I've always questioned whether the large language models that Epic is building and fighting with various vendors who want that information of their patients' data. And Epic is saying, screw you, that's ours, and where that's going to go.
yeah,
And that's huge. And so the publishing world is a little bit ahead because the intellectual property that it was created by people that write books or articles was just grabbed by hundreds, if not thousands, of AI developers, and that's all going to shake down eventually because
mhm,
basically, and it'll be interesting to see if what they do with because copyright's an old protection that was given so that people would use their time wisely and they would get compensated for it. But I don't know if it's relevant anymore. I've one of the reasons I left the industry is I could see this becoming a day where I'd spend all my time talking to lawyers. So I just basically retired. And now it's happening because we have an interest, the way an agency runs, we have an interest in our clients' intellectual property that they license to publishers. So the publishers are pissed off because they don't want to lose their business, but so are the intellectual property creators and writers and film people and everything. I mean, it's wild, wild west out there. And it's touching us now as we're talking about building AI models for using our data, which is our personal medical data, to let them make money on it. How do we get compensated, or do we ever? It's just going to be a shithouse mess. So
So I guess let
that's a legal term. It's
it's a
called a
Yeah.
shithouse mess.
it,
You know.
it's and it's a legal question. So I guess let me jump in quickly for this one for the Anthropic case. Right. So the Anthropic decision before the settlement was twofold. Right. There were two issues. One was training their AI model on all this copyrighted content was copyright infringement. And for that one, the judge actually said no, it wasn't. The other question was taking these books and stripping them and copying them and then creating a library, right? Was that copyright infringement? And the judge said yes, right? And that was the reason that Anthropic settled.
Okay.
Right.
I'd like
But
to if I don't want to interrupt, but I'm conscious of the time, and I want to always give everyone the final word. So Ari and Dina, kind of your summary thoughts, anything you want to leave us with.
it's an emerging technology. I think using it is great, but you have to be aware of the risks, right? Which is hallucinations and lack of privacy.
I'll say that, we've spent the topic of this meeting was, AI and privacy, and that obviously bubbles to the surface concerns, some real, some imagined, some, not imminent today, but, will be on the horizon. And the thing that I'd be interested in maybe doing a part two, Brad, which is the positive sides, given that all is not perfect in the medical complex, whatever you want to call it, behind the HIPAA wall. And, there are obvious benefits to patients. How real are they? How imagined are they? But I would love to actually kind of look at the other side of this, vis-a-vis like what is the alternative that patients are facing today, which is, it has its own problems that are imminent. Many of us deal with it, like today, here and now. And so, what are kind of the implications on the positive side? And what might that bright future actually look like? So I guess we've been focusing on the negative, and there's a lot to process, and much of it that we do not understand. That is a emerging landscape that kind of makes it fun, but also let's not lose sight that, my God, this is like the craziest technology I've ever seen. It's ridiculous. And so you can see that in the usage. People aren't dumb. They are engaging with these models. When you look at the retention, which is a classic way of looking at how successful a product is, the retention on some of these LLMs is mind-bogglingly strong, which is to say people engage, and they engage a lot and over again. Is that good? Is it bad? And what is the value they're actually getting vis-a-vis kind of the medical angle here? Anyway, this is a very rich conversation. It's not going to start and end here, but privacy and data, compliance and these kind of things is one part of it, but there's many other parts to explore. So appreciate you having me here.